familial DNA has given them the name of a suspect.
Welcome to WatchMojo, and today we're looking at 10 murders that were solved years after the murderers' deaths.
The killer died in 2006 in a motorcycle accident 14 years after the murder.
For this list, we're looking at murder cold cases where the perpetrator had already passed on before the crime was solved. Are there any other killers who evaded justice through death? Let us know in the comments. Susan Galvin. In 1967, 20-year-old Susan Galvin worked as a records clerk for the Seattle Police Department. After missing her shift on July 10th, Galvin was reported missing, and her body was later found in the parking lot of the Seattle Center.
The one suspect SPD had was never charged for lack of evidence.
The case grew cold over the years until 2002, when investigators retrieved some DNA from Galvin's underwear. However, this failed to turn up any matches. Then, in 2018 and 2019, using the same groundbreaking technology that helped to catch the Golden State Killer, they were able to link the crime to Frank Whippich. The only problem was that Whippich, who worked as a security guard at the Seattle Center, passed on in 1987 from complications due to diabetes.
Seattle police say it is the oldest case where genetic genealogy has identified the killer.
Virginia Freeman. On December 1st, 1981, Virginia Freeman, who was a realtor in Texas, left home for a house showing and never returned. When her body was later discovered by her husband, it was clear that the 40-year-old wife and mother had died a vicious death.
It was a vicious crime.
In 1997, investigators tried to link DNA from Freeman's fingernails with that of James Otto Earhart, a convicted murderer on death row. They failed to obtain a sample from Earhart in time, and he was executed in 1999. When more concrete evidence surfaced that pointed towards Earhart, it was already too late. His corpse was finally exhumed in 2018, and the DNA samples collected matched with that obtained from the crime scene.
But his son gave the sheriff's office a sample of his own DNA, and it was a match.
Mary Agnes Klinsky. It took over 50 years to solve the murder of New Jersey high school senior Mary Agnes Klinsky. Klinsky's body was found on September 16, 1965, having suffered blunt force injuries to the head and an apparent assault. Even though her family finally got the closure they needed, they never got to see her killer, Robert Zirinsky, truly pay for his crimes. Zirinsky was serving a life sentence for another murder and awaiting trial for a third case when he died of pulmonary fibrosis in 2008.
The death of the 18-year-old Hazlitt girl is one of several Bayshore killings attributed to Zirinsky.
He was confirmed as the perpetrator of Klinsky's murder in 2016, when DNA retained from the original investigation matched his profile. Zirinsky was also a suspect in 3 other killings.
After learning the case had been closed, her 71-year-old sister-in-law said she and her husband were glad it had been solved.
Helen Sullivan. The senseless 1972 murder of 58-year-old Helen Sullivan in her Long Beach, California home left police puzzled for decades. Although DNA evidence and partial fingerprints were collected from the crime scene, the case went unsolved, largely due to lack of the appropriate technology. But as time evolved and the technology was developed, it was revisited by investigators backed by the National Institute of Justice. In 2012, 40 years after the unfortunate incident, the evidence was linked to an ex-con named Emmanuel Miller. Miller, who was a career criminal, had just been paroled shortly before the murder. Sullivan's family only received partial closure, however, as Miller passed on in 1990. Joan Harrison. The Yorkshire Ripper claimed the lives of 13 women between 1975 and 1980. At one point, the authorities believed that the infamous killer was also responsible for the death of Joan Harrison. Harrison was only 26 years old when her body was discovered in an abandoned garage in 1975. However, investigators never found evidence linking the Yorkshire Ripper to the murder because they weren't connected.
So someone else wrote those letters. Someone else killed Joan Harrison.
Harrison's killer was actually a convicted criminal named Christopher Smith, who died of cancer in 2008. Before his death, Smith was made to give a DNA sample after he was arrested for drunk driving. It was this sample and a handwritten confession he left behind that confirmed him as the perpetrator of the crime 3 years later. Everett Delano. Retired Navy veteran Everett Delano was working at a garage in New Hampshire when he was shot and killed by an armed robber. The crime, which occurred on September 1, 1966, went unsolved for over 50 years, becoming the state's longest-running cold case. In 2013, the case was reopened, and police quickly zeroed in on a seasoned criminal named Thomas Cass, after his fingerprints matched those retrieved from the crime scene.
A fingerprint was lifted off the handle of a faucet that was left running at the scene.
Before he could be arrested, Cass took his own life in 2014, reportedly first hinting to his partner that he was involved in the crime. The fingerprint match and the statements made by Cass led police to conclude in 2019 that he was, in fact, Everett Delano's killer.
We are happy this day has come where our family has been given a small measure of justice.
Angela Kleinsorge. More than 2 decades after 84-year-old Angela Kleinsorge was assaulted and killed in her San Diego home, police finally solved the case.
Even back then, neighbors wanted answers.
Kleinsorge was murdered by one of her neighbors, Jeffrey Falls, who was still a teenager in 1992 when the incident occurred. Falls, however, evaded punishment for his crime, as he died in a motorcycle accident back in 2006. Investigators were able to link him with Kleinsorge's murder in 2017 through familial DNA testing.
Familial DNA allows us to search offender databases with wider parameters.
Evidence from the crime scene matched Falls' brother and indicated that a member of his family was the perpetrator. Tissue samples from Falls' corpse were then obtained from the coroner's office and led to his identification as Kleinsorge's murderer.
Although the killer is no longer alive, the fact that he was identified brings some closure to the victim's family.
Virginia Vincent. On September 20th, 1985, the body of Virginia Vincent was found in her Danville, California apartment by a neighbor. Vincent had been assaulted and killed by an unknown individual. Although an extensive investigation was initially carried out, the case lacked any promising leads and eventually grew cold. It was reopened in 2017, and investigators once again relied on familial DNA testing to crack the case. They reanalyzed the crime scene evidence and found a likely suspect in a man named Joey Lynn Ford. Ford was 36 years old when he died in 1997, 12 years after the killing. His corpse was exhumed and a DNA sample was collected, which matched that found at the crime scene. Karen Klass. The ex-wife of the Righteous Brothers singer Bill Medley, Karen Klass was attacked in her home on January 30th, 1976. She was found unconscious and taken to the hospital, where she sadly passed on 5 days later without regaining consciousness.
On February 4th, 5 days after the attack, Karen dies from her injuries.
After decades passed with no promising leads, investigators turned to familial DNA testing, which pointed them towards one Kenneth Troyer. In 2017, Troyer's DNA was positively linked to biological evidence retrieved from the crime scene, identifying him as the murderer. Troyer was a notorious criminal who was serving time in prison for burglary when he broke out in 1982. He was killed that same year after engaging in a shootout with police officers who attempted to recapture him.
It's amazing because I did not believe that we would ever identify who had committed this crime.
Before we continue, be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos. You have the option to be notified for occasional videos or all of them. If you're on your phone, make sure you go into your settings and switch on notifications. Jenny Zatricki. In 2018, the body of convicted criminal Robert Brashers was exhumed by authorities in Arkansas. After analysis was carried out on the DNA samples collected from the corpse, Brashers was linked to several murder cases, one of which was that of Jenny Zatricki.
And the relentless commitment of the detectives that worked the case that ultimately cracked it.
Back in 1990, 28-year-old Zatricki was assaulted and strangled to death in her Greenville, South Carolina apartment. While investigators worked tirelessly on the puzzling case, Brashers went on a crime spree across multiple states throughout the 90s and even served 5 years in prison during that period. He put an end to his own crimes when he shot himself during a run-in with police in 1999.
Days turned into weeks, weeks to months, months to years.